Domestic violence occurs in the home, so preventing domestic violence begins in the home with the family or ainga. Domestic violence is defined as a pattern of abusive behavior in any relationship that is used by one partner to gain power and control over another intimate partner. It can be physical, sexual, emotional, economic, or psychological actions or threats of actions. More than 15 million children in the U.S. live in homes in which domestic violence has happened at least once.
Are you living with domestic abuse? Do you need support, advice, or safe and secure accommodation? These services are available to you today through Catholic Social Services and the Department of Human Social Services. For Catholic Social Services, call 684-699-5683 or email cssfatuainga@yahoo.com. For Department of Human Social Services, call 684-633-1571, 1572, or 1573. If you are in an emergency situation, call 911. Abuse protection orders and harassment prevention orders are available if you need them. For additional free resources and information, contact the Alliance at 699-0272 or on the web at www.asalliance.co.
American Samoa is known to have intergenerational domestic abuse. This is when abusive behavior patterns within a family are passed down from one generation to another. It can take many forms like physical, emotional, sexual, and financial abuse, and it affects families across all types of backgrounds. One thing that contributes to intergenerational domestic abuse in American Samoa is when we act like these types of abuse are normal. Children in abusive households often grow up thinking that violence and abuse are the normal ways of handling conflict. They become numb to the abuse and feel like there's nothing wrong with it. This normalization leads to children of victims becoming abusers themselves. To break the cycle of intergenerational domestic abuse, we must provide these families reliable and confidential help, including counseling and even shelter at times. Intergenerational domestic abuse is a great problem in American Samoa that needs to be responded to immediately. By providing direct support and prevention measures, we can work to break the chain of abuse and create safer, more healthy families and communities.
Resiliency is the ability to bounce back from difficult events in life. Victims of domestic violence have shown that they can survive and even thrive despite their traumatic experiences. To build resiliency, it's important that you don't dwell on negative thinking. Focusing on negative thoughts makes it difficult to see the solution because you're dwelling on the problem and it can keep you stuck in the same place. When those negative feelings come, remember to shift your thinking to something positive. Think of something you can look forward to, like going to the beach or watching a sunset. You can also go for a walk to give your brain a break from negative thinking. Take action by creating a goal for yourself and make a plan to get it done. If needed, call your friends or family to help focus on the chore. When focused, you can accomplish even the smallest task, and when you add up all the small tasks, you realize you can take care of the bigger ones too. Be optimistic and remember that circumstances can change. Even during the most difficult times, there are good things to look forward to. Resilience builds character, and character gives hope. And when you're hopeful, you keep moving in the right direction. After the outbreak of the coronavirus in 2020, lockdowns were imposed to reduce the spread of COVID-19. The mandated isolations had an unforeseen impact on domestic violence around the world. The substantial surge in domestic and intimate partner violence following the lockdowns was called the shadow pandemic by the United Nations in a 2021 report. According to statistics around the world, domestic violence cases increased by 25 to 33%. It's hard to know the impact of the shadow pandemic here in American Samoa because many abuse cases are never reported. In some instances, victims are ashamed to report their abuse because it will make the ainga, or family, look bad. According to a 2019 report, 68% of Samoan women have been abused by their husband, parents, or other women. If the worldwide increase of 25 to 33% caused by the shadow pandemic are also true in American Samoa, that would put our current rate of abused Samoan women at 80 to 90%. Those are devastating numbers if true. Help bring an end to domestic and intimate partner violence in American Samoa. Let your voice be heard. For more information, call the American Samoa Alliance Against Domestic and Sexual Violence at 699-0272 or on the web at www.asalliance.co.
COVID-19 variants are on the rise, so it's important that we do our part to help keep American Samoa safe. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, all currently approved or authorized COVID-19 vaccines are safe and effective and reduce your risk of severe illness. Vaccination can reduce the spread of disease, which helps protect those who get vaccinated and the people around them. So get yourself vaccinated or get boosted. Wash your hands thoroughly, social distance, and mask up. Some businesses are not requiring masks, but if you feel sick or you've been around someone who has shown symptoms, mask up for those around you. The best way to prevent the new variants is to slow the spread of the virus. Choose outdoor activities whenever possible, wash your hands thoroughly, avoid close contact with others, wear a mask in public when possible, and stay home if you're feeling sick or have COVID-19 symptoms.
The time to have a plan is before something happens. Safety plans can include actions like the following. Identify your boundaries. Practice saying no with a clear and forceful voice. Defend your boundaries even with the smallest violation. Speak up if a relationship with a friend, peer, or adult begins to change and move in directions that make you uncomfortable. Trust your feelings. Say no if you find yourself doing things you do not feel right about and find a way to exit the situation. Recognize that you have a right to stop someone from doing something to you, even if you allowed the behavior to happen before. If you are going out, know everyone you are going out with. Know where you are going before you leave to go out. Identify ways of physically exiting a space once you arrive. Have a buddy and agree on a signal to alert them that you need help. If you are drinking, pour your own drink and monitor how intoxicated you are becoming. Have a backup plan in case your initial plan does not work. For more information, call the Alliance at 699-0272 or find us on the web at www.asalliance.co.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Judy Matuptia. I'm the training coordinator with the American Samoa Alliance. And welcome to today's webinar. Today, it is such a pleasure to have us, to have with us again, Marissa Sia. She is the psychology postdoctoral resident with the VA, the Veterans Affairs Pacific Islands healthcare system in Hawaii. This is not the first time Marissa is doing a webinar that Marissa has done a webinar on identification and assessment of eating disorders. She did one last year, And we got a good number of people, of folks joining us. So this is a follow-up to that. We wanted her to come back and do a follow-up on that because she was talking last year. For those of us who joined in, Marissa was able to make the connection of eating disorders and the trauma that we have in our lives. And because a lot of us here, as Samoans, when we talk about eating disorders, we instantly think of eating too much, you know. And it's just we think that, oh, we just have a bad habit of eating too much. And many of us don't realize because of the many other things that we go through in life, especially violent relationships, the violence that we go through in life that causes trauma, that creates that trauma, that also then creates that eating disorder. But I don't want to give all of that away because Marissa is here to do that. I'm just excited that Marissa's here and that we're all going to be joining in because this is a big part of not just the work, but our lives, and it's important that we understand this part. So we're going to start off today with wellness because that's how we roll here at the Alliance. We always love to start off with wellness. And I am going to turn the time over to Monica. We have Monica, our community educator, who is going to lead us in a short wellness exercise before we start today's discussion.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Judy, for giving the opportunity over so we can start wellness this morning. Wellness this morning will be about refocusing our breathing and energy. So, Talofa, again, I will be guiding you through this wellness exercise that will help you, one, refocus your energy and your mind today. We are going to go into simple breathing exercises. So before we get into it, we will start by placing ourselves in a comfortable position. Make sure you feel grounded by placing your feet on the ground. Make sure you feel comfortable and warm through sitting in any position that comforts you. Last but not the least, allow yourself to trust me to guide you along the exercise. Along the exercise, you will hear me say, tap your fingers together. And this is what I meant. You can tap it in any pace that makes you feel comfortable. But I hope you trust me. Follow my voice and go ahead and close your eyes. Um, I'll give you a moment now I'll give you a moment to ground yourself. Awesome. So now that we have grounded ourselves and we got into our comfortable position and you have given me your trust, let's go ahead and start by taking a few deep breaths in. Slowly take a deep breath in, hold it, and exhale. Awesome. Again, take that deep breath in, hold it, and exhale. Awesome. Now, the next breath should feel different because I want you to inhale to the point where your chest expands, like you're taking a deep breath in before taking a dive. And when you exhale, make sure all the stresses and the worries you have along with carbon dioxide will be exhaled. And inhale, hold it, and exhale. Take that one more time. Inhale through the nose, hold it, and exhale. Very well. Now we're going to start going back to soft breaths. But this time, I would want you to start tapping your fingers together. Tapping your fingers together will help you tap all the worries that you have away. Tap your fingers through any pace that brings comfort to you. Now, as you are tapping and breathing, I want to share some kind words of affirmations with you to start the day off. You are beautiful. You are smart. You are kind. You are important. It's okay to make mistakes, for we all learn from them. But I just want to remind you that you are greatness. You are empowered. You are going to do great things today. And if you need a break, take it. If you need to breathe, do it. Again, you are beautiful. You are smart. You are kind. You are important. Now, slowly place your hands on your desk, lap, or wherever you feel comfortable, and slowly open your eyes. Let's all take that one deep breath in together and exhale. I just wanted to share that you guys did so awesome. And thank you for allowing me into your safe space and for trusting me into leading you through this wellness. Um, I'll go ahead and give back the time over to Miss Judy. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica, for wellness this morning, for the breathing exercise. I hope everybody was able to join, be part of that wellness exercise. And we wish everybody well this morning. With everything you're doing, you're going to be doing if after today's discussion and so forth. On more information about wellness, if you're not familiar with wellness, please feel free to connect with the Alliance at 659-0272, or check us on our Facebook page, or go to our website at www.asalliance.com. Before I turn it over to our facilitator for today's wellness, I wanted to acknowledge the presence of one of our partners, one of our allies, one of our family members, you name it, she's everything. And that's our very own Dr. Juwita McCutcheon. I know we all work here, and I know Marissa's been here. She's visited American Samoa, and she's probably come to realize that we are a very small community here in American Samoa. We're so small, and people like Dr. Itza and myself and everybody else that's probably on here. We all work here, but we rarely see each other because we wear so many hats. But I only wear a couple versus Dr. Juwita's hats. She um
Killing mo pulo.
and that's why I'm saying this, because this is the first time I'm seeing her for like so long, in a while. It's been a while. So good morning, doctor. It is so good to see you. Welcome back. I know you've been in and out of the island. I hope you are well. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you. I'm actually not back. I'm actually almost there. I'll be back
Okay.
tonight. So I'm in Hawaii right now on the way back from IVAT. But I'm very grateful, always so grateful for our alliance partners. We always come back to our partnerships, and I think that that's what really makes the difference. And I'm grateful for Dr. Sia being willing to talk about this and bring this up, because it's not discussed as readily in our community when it comes
Mhm.
to eating disorders, or disordered eating, and the connection to trauma. So I'm just really privileged to be able to work alongside her, and then also to work alongside our alliance partners. Always here, whether in person or otherwise. So I'll turn the time over to Dr. Sia.
Thank you, Doc. Thank you so much. Um, it's all yours, Marissa. We'll be here, and if you need any support, just call out my name. We're all here to support you as you lead today's discussion. Thank you again for joining us and for being here today.
Thank you for having me. So I will begin by sharing my screen and hopefully this works. Is everybody able to see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'll begin then. Good morning. My name is Marissa Sia. I am a psychology postdoctoral resident at the VA Pacific Islands, and I've worked with Dr. McCutcheon now for about 2 years, really helping to take care of our rural, what we consider rural health veterans, so those residing in places like American Samoa, Guam, Saipan, other US Pacific territories. And so it's been really, really a great opportunity to be able to work with Dr. McCutcheon and to be able to now collaborate with the Alliance for the second time because it's so much fun and it's a great opportunity. So thank you for having me. So today, what I wanted to just review is why we're going to be talking about eating disorders. And I do think that this is a very important topic that's not touched on very often. Partly because there is a misperception of what eating disorders are, or what they may look like. And I think that really does a disservice to this issue because if we don't ask certain questions about what these things are and how they might look and who they affect, we really don't know that they exist. And there's a lot of consequences to eating disorders that I'll talk about. And so, really just wanted to raise awareness about asking questions and really understanding these things better. So we'll talk about some eating disorder myths first, define them as they are defined by our Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Psychological Disorders. We'll discuss kind of the relationship between eating disorders and trauma, the consequences of eating disorders, and then we'll try to touch on how eating disorders may look or how they might show up in Pacific Islanders, with the caveat that the research is super, super scarce. So I'm going to call upon a lot of participation or just thoughts or questions that folks may have because I really want this to be a collaborative process. We'll talk about a brief screening approach to kind of um, highlight who may be at risk for disordered eating or an eating disorder. And if they are to potentially screen positive, quote unquote, then what we would do further to assess. And then I'm going to provide some treatment options. And so this piece is really to understand whether you're a provider or someone in the community, how to talk about these things. So if someone's really needing help with an eating disorder or disordered eating, to be able to have relevant information about here's a place that you can go to, here's a treatment that may be helpful, really facilitate those conversations. And then we'll wrap up with some resources and tips and then questions. And please feel free to interrupt me at any point with questions or comments that you may have. So firstly, we're going to talk about eating disorder myths. And so one of the common eating disorder myths that I hear is that you must be underweight to have an eating disorder. And so there's this misperception that eating disorders look like someone who is skin and bones. So they may look like or resemble close to a skeleton. And that's typically what comes to mind when people think of eating disorders. And in fact, the research shows pretty much the opposite, that people in all shapes and sizes can have eating disorders, and that most folks that actually have eating disorders are of average weight or are overweight. And so that's to really say we can't just look at somebody and know that person has an eating disorder. We really have to investigate a little bit further to really understand what's going on. The next myth is that eating disorders only affect young white women. So we often hear like this is a teenage problem, teenage girls, upper middle class, just a very specific demographic, and actually that's not the case. It has been historically so that research has been done in communities where samples are young white women or adolescents, and unfortunately eating disorders are very common in those populations, particularly with adolescents. And what we're finding more and more in the research is that there are increasing rates of eating disorders or disordered eating in men, non binary identified folks, and across various ethnicities. So they're finding more and more that eating disorder prevalence is increasing, unfortunately, across ethnicities around the globe. And then there's this idea that, or myth that, eating disorders are all about beauty and appearance. And so there's this idea or perception that someone is vain or that they're so fixated on their appearance and it's all about looks. And we also know that that's not true at all. Some people that have eating disorders or disordered eating may have body image distortions or concerns, or they may be worried about how they look. And also, we know that there are actually a lot of behaviors that come about. So a lot of those restricting eating or over exercising or vomiting, binging that arise as attempts to manage stress. And unfortunately, then kind of fold into what we see in eating disorders. So that fixation on body image or fixation on losing weight or maintaining some sort of control in their lives. So really attempts to manage stress, not necessarily to be beautiful. And then I also wanted to note that there's this myth that eating disorders are not serious conditions, that if somebody eats more, they'll be fine. So often hear this phrase of like just eat a cheeseburger and you'll be fine. And that's really not the case. It's not as simple as that. And I will talk more about why that is. And unfortunately, eating disorders are very serious conditions. They have one of the highest mortality rates of any psychiatric disorder. And then finally, that there's a myth that eating disorders are a choice. People can stop if they want to. And, it can be that some people are choosing to eat or not eat as much or eating too much, and sometimes it is a choice. And what differentiates that versus disordered eating and an eating disorder is that it feels very much like it's not a choice. And the data actually shows that there are a lot of changes that happen in the brain that reinforce pathways that make this behavior very much like an addiction, very similarly to I feel compelled to engage in this behavior because I'm so stressed out or I'm so anxious or I feel so bad, and this is a way for me to feel better. So, really wanted to preface all of these topics with those facts in mind. So, we're going to talk about some of the eating disorders that we have in our Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Psychological Disorders. First of which is anorexia nervosa, commonly called anorexia, which is defined by chronic food restriction. So this is like severely under eating or starving oneself to a point where one's body weight is below what's typically normal for that person's age and development. The disturbances can be manifested in concern about weight or shape. There may be a lot of fear about weight gain or becoming fat, um, and along with disturbances in the way we experience our own body. The next of which is bulimia nervosa, also called normally bulimia. And this is really characterized by episodes of binge eating. And so this is one that I really wanted to bring attention to because I think a lot of times people have a misperception of what binge eating is. And so really this is consuming an unusually large amount of food in a very short period of time. So this is not really just eating two plates of food and feeling like, oh, I really should have not eaten that second plate. It is eating potentially 4 to 5 plates worth of food. Um, the example that comes to my mind is a large sheet cake. So large sheet cake, and people will eat that beyond the point where they're full to the point where they're uncomfortably full in a short period of time. And that is then followed by what we call compensatory behaviors. So we call those purging behaviors. So this can be self-induced vomiting, laxative or diuretic use, fasting, or excessive exercise. And so really just wanted to bring some attention to that. Binge eating
Dr.
disorder has,
Sia,
go ahead.
just wanted to add in, because a lot of times when we think about fasting, people will do that, and then just to think about this is the difference is excessive, right? So thinking about that in
Mhm.
terms of because a lot of people may fast, but it's the difference of whether it's getting in the way
Mhm.
of their life.
Yes, and the thank you for that clarification, Dr. McCutcheon, because the fasting that we're talking about here is really chronic. So it's not just like a one-off thing or part of intermittent fasting, which we'll talk about as well. It is really to compensate for this binging behavior, and it becomes very much a pattern, and so this repetitive pattern that occurs. And so the third eating disorder that we'll talk about is binge eating disorder, which has all the characteristics of bulimia without the purging or compensatory behaviors. So again, eating an unusually large amount of food in a very small period of time without any purging behaviors. And this again is not to say that if you overeat one time you have binge eating disorder. It's really to highlight that this is a pattern. So this is an enduring pattern that occurs multiple times a week for many months, and causes one a lot of distress, as all disorders typically do. And then the fourth category that I think is a great addition to our manual of psychological disorders is this other specified feeding and eating disorder. We typically just call it OSFED, as the acronym kind of spells out. But I do think this is a really important category because a lot of folks with eating disorders or disordered eating, so you kind of hear both terms. We have both terms because unfortunately, majority of folks that suffer from these symptoms don't neatly fall into one of the three categories of anorexia, bulimia, or binge eating disorder. And so the other specified category is really helpful in capturing those people that may not meet criteria otherwise, and this can actually open up opportunity to treatments and discussion and information, and so I do think it's an important category. And then lastly, I wanted to point out two of the lesser known feeding and eating disorders that we have in our manual, but I think were highlighted in the last time that I gave this presentation. So I just wanted to talk about avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, or ARFID. And this is really not necessarily due to disturbance in body image or weight, or this need to change one's body, but is really manifested by a lack of interest or avoidance in certain foods based on the sensory characteristics, meaning like textures or temperatures of food, um, that lead to nutritional deficiencies or weight loss. And so this is seen a lot in children with autism spectrum disorders, intellectual disabilities, or ADHD. And it's more than just picky eating. It's that it's so enduring that children often are not meeting the developmental markers. And so really wanted to point that out. And then last one is pica. So pica is a persistent, so chronic again, pattern of eating substances that have no nutritional value. And so unfortunately, what this can look like is potentially very dangerous. People can eat or consume soap, hair, metal, rocks, things that have no nutritional value. And there's a lot of reasons why that may happen, but none of which are very conclusive in the research. This can happen in childhood. This can happen, I've heard, in women who become pregnant, um, and can be attributed to things like iron deficiency. But again, jury is still out on that one, but wanted to highlight. So, any questions so far?
Question, doctor.
Mhm.
Um, so, you mentioned binge eating and then fasting.
Mhm.
So is it good to fast then
Mm.
if there's a probability that that can cause one to maybe stop binge eating. And I only ask that because as a people, um, as Samoans, many of us have these religious beliefs, and fasting is like a big part of some of the religious beliefs that we have.
Yeah.
And so is that so is that good or bad?
That's a great question. So we'll touch on this more in detail in a few slides, but what I can say is that it depends. And so we're going to
Okay.
talk about the role of food and cultural norms around food and how we eat. And so what I will say is that fasting in and of itself is not a bad thing. There's actually data coming about that shows things like intermittent fasting can have health benefits
Mm,
and simultaneously, so that's one piece. It can be helpful, it can be okay. And when it becomes this behavior that we engage in, not for religious purposes or community building or social gathering or cultural purposes, and it is more fixated on, I am fasting because I am so deeply upset with my body, or I am so stressed out and this is a way to manage my stress, or that it becomes so chronic that you're not just fasting for a day or a week, but folks end up fasting for long periods of time and it's just this chronic pattern. That's where we want to just step back and say, okay, is this okay, or is there something else going on that we should explore further? So, not to say that someone has an eating disorder if you're just fasting, but maybe want to investigate further.
thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. So please feel free to hop in, ask any more questions throughout, interrupt me as you will. I'm going to touch on the relationship between eating disorders and trauma. So unfortunately, there is an overlap between the two, and the reasons why are not entirely concrete. But we'll talk about some of the preliminary findings and why there may be a relationship. And what we do know is that there is a relationship between childhood or adulthood exposure to trauma. So this can be sexual trauma, physical trauma, emotional trauma, trauma in many forms, and eating disorders, unfortunately. And what is also quite disturbing is that children who have experienced childhood trauma or abuse have a 3.21 times greater likelihood of developing an eating disorder. And so, what we could think, and some of the hypotheses that are coming out, is that this relationship exist because the eating disorder behavior is a way to cope with the stress of experiences of trauma. When we experience trauma, or when children experience trauma, it is so chaotic, it's so out of one's control, and it's just this place of just despair. And I just imagine that eating disorder behaviors can be a way to exert control over something when your environment is so chaotic. So really thinking about the ties between those things. And this other statistic that's quite staggering is that children who experience abuse or trauma at an earlier age, so being younger and experiencing a trauma, tend to have an earlier age of onset if they do develop eating disorders. And so, not to say that if you experience childhood trauma, especially at an early age, that you're bound or destined to have an eating disorder. It's just that when they look at folks who have an eating disorder later in life, they typically have had experiences of childhood trauma. And if you experience early childhood trauma, it is related to then experiencing more severe and frequent eating disorder symptoms. So I'll do one more slide on trauma and then we'll talk about some questions if any are coming up. So just wanted to point out, in adulthood, research suggests that trauma experienced in adulthood contributes to eating disorder problems over, above events experienced in childhood. And so the the problems that come about from eating disorders can really be quite impactful and quite difficult to manage when folks experience trauma in adulthood. And this is particularly pronounced in those who have experienced interpersonal violence or sexual violence, unfortunately. And so I do think that this is an important topic to discuss, especially with the alliances. Um, the Alliance serves a lot of folks in the community who have may experience these things. And to also note that PTSD diagnoses and symptoms are higher in those with eating disorders. So just kind of thinking about those pieces, does anyone have any questions? Okay. So why then this relationship between, um, oh, let me, okay, I see a chat that I'm just checking. Yeah. So thank you for Liza from Facebook agreeing with uh, childhood trauma and then the environment being very chaotic and potentially developing eating disorders. So thank you for sharing. So I'm going to discuss why this relationship between eating disorders and trauma may exist. And again, this is just a big may. Nothing conclusive is really being highlighted quite yet, but the research is ongoing, which is great because I do think that these two, trauma and eating disorders, is a very important relationship to highlight. So the first reason why there may be this relationship is that, unfortunately, those with eating disorders and those who have experienced trauma are likely to have other mental health diagnosis. And so this could be things like depression or anxiety, or perhaps a substance use disorder, tend to occur in both of these populations. And then a lot of times, those with eating disorders have difficulties regulating their own emotions. And so, what we find is that people with eating disorders can try to regulate emotions through their behaviors. And so, this can really be shown in I feel super stressed out, and so I'm going to engage in binge behavior, or I feel super upset with my spouse or my partner or my family. And so I'm going to go and I'm going to not just exercise for like a good half an hour, but I'm going to exercise for 3.5 hours until my shins have shin splints. And this is also shown similarly in those who experience trauma. We see folks isolating as a result of trauma, or conversely, acting out and having outbursts as a result of trauma. And so the emotional regulation piece is very common between the two. And then thirdly, there are these maladaptive thoughts, or these negative thoughts that come up. As Dr. McCutcheon will call them often, they're called ANTs, so automatic negative thoughts that may manifest from those with eating disorders or those with trauma. And so this can really look like a thought like that is in the bubble, I'm not good enough. And so we see this very frequently in eating disorders in regards to not only their body or their weight, but just their whole self image and self esteem. Like, me as a person, I am just not good enough. And we also unfortunately see very similar thoughts expressed from folks with trauma who have experienced trauma, that I'm not good enough, or it's my fault that I am this way. It's my fault that I survived and somebody else didn't, in terms of those with PTSD. And then finally, there's a really interesting research that's being conducted that shows misperception of social cues. And so, what I mean by that is, those with eating disorders tend to perceive social interactions. So the example that I give is that if we were to all walk into a restaurant one day and we sit down at a table and we're chatting with our friends and family, and then a couple tables over, there's this loud person who's just talking boisterously, and they're using their hands like this, and um, they're, very, very audibly loud. And we're like, wow, what's going on over there? He seems, or they seem really animated. Someone with an eating disorder or someone who's experienced trauma might interpret that instead as, ooh, that's dangerous, that's a threat. Um, I I don't like it. So this like negative perception of social cues that may not actually be negative in that way. Okay, so I'm going to pause again. Any questions? Doc, anything that you wanted to add?
I was just thinking about Liz's comment and just being grateful for where she's at and recognizing that. But then also the misperception of social cues, just kind of looking at someone and thinking, or thinking that they're misinterpreting what they're thinking or judging you, right? So
Mhm.
sometimes it's like, oh, they're looking at me, they think that I'm, that I am ugly or I'm not worthy. Like
Mhm.
those are other thoughts that I think can come up too.
Mhm. Absolutely. I think to dovetail off of that, Dr. McCutcheon, there's a lot of research that I actually conducted a couple years ago that was suggesting that folks with eating disorders actually they do really perceive others' glances or um, interactions as negative. And so there's this high level of what we call fear of negative evaluation in folks with eating disorders. So they really think that this person is really negatively evaluating me and kind of contributes then to more eating disorder behaviors. And then I see another chat, Facebook chat. So obesity may really be caused by someone's personal issues versus one's diet. I would say it can be both. So we'll talk about that as well, and that obesity is actually a risk factor for binge eating disorder in particular. And also, just because one is obese doesn't mean that you'll develop an eating disorder, and does not actually mean necessarily that you are obese because of a personal issue. And we'll talk about why that is and what the distinction is. Okay. So we wanted to really dive into the meat and bones of things, why screening is important. And it's because eating disorders have so many consequences that we might not typically think about. So the first of which is that there are many physical complications that result from eating disorders. So there can be changes in blood pressure, so hypertension or hypotension, so high and low blood pressure that can be quite dangerous. GI complications, so gastrointestinal issues like GERD, acid reflux, that happens a lot with people with bulimia, diabetes, obesity, and then most significantly high mortality rates. And so this is largely caused by problems in the heart, so cardiovascular complications. There are also a lot of psychological consequences of eating disorders. And so I really wanted to draw attention to what we call comorbid diagnoses. And so what we know is that if, for example, someone has anorexia, they have about a 95% chance of also having another psychiatric disorder. So this could be someone has anorexia and depression, anxiety and anorexia. So that's oh, I'm sorry, I misquoted that. 56% of folks with anorexia, and then 95% of folks with bulimia may have then, again, another diagnosis of potentially depression, anxiety, substance use disorders. And then for binge eating disorder, it's about 79% of folks will have uh, that disorder and another one. And then one of the consequences that we don't often think about, but is actually really important, is that eating disorders are very costly. And so if anyone has known anybody who's received treatment for an eating disorders, it really requires quite a high degree of collaboration, of care, and money. And so individuals with eating disorders spend about $1,870 more in annual healthcare costs than those without. And those with eating disorders actually can stay the longest in inpatient facilities. So this can be like hospitalization that cost about $19,400 over the span of 2 weeks. So that's a lot of money in 2 weeks, um, and that's more than severe mental illness like schizophrenia or psychosis. So it's quite staggering. And also, there's a lot of productivity that can be lost from people who have eating disorders because it is so difficult to function, whether they are in hospital settings where they're unable to work, whether their behaviors become repetitive and almost compulsive to the degree that they can't engage meaningfully with others or in their work meaningfully with others. And then lastly, there's this huge interpersonal effect and consequence of eating disorders. It can be that those with eating disorders end up really having a difficult time taking care of themselves. I'm thinking very much of those with any eating disorder who may have health complications that arise, and that makes them really unable to take care of themselves sometimes, and it may require leaning on another person in the family, another person in the community to help take care of oneself, or that these things can reduce participation in pleasurable or social activities. So really thinking about how if someone is fixated on food or fixated on body weight and shape, that it can be really hard to then go out and engage in a social gathering that is centered around food, as is very common in Hawaii and very common in Samoa. And so these things can be really difficult then on the social aspect of things. Um, Looking again at the chat, as a person who had an eating disorder, can this be a cause of fibromyalgia? What I don't know that specific relationship, but what I do know is that there are relationships between generally psychiatric disorders and chronic pain. And so I apologize that I don't have a more specific answer, but there definitely is research out there that talks a lot about the correlation between chronic pain and mental health issues. So before I dive into Pacific Islanders specifically, are there any other questions that I could answer or any comments? And thank you so much to those who are engaging in the comments and in the chat. Okay, so please feel free again, interrupt me at any time. I wanted to draw some attention to eating disorders in Pacific Islanders, especially because there's not much attention, unfortunately, not much attention to and not much treatment for eating disorders that has been centered around Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander individuals. Unfortunately, I was reading an article that said of all ethnic groups, so there was many ethnic groups that this study covered, Pacific Islanders and South, I think it was Southern Europeans had the least number of publications pertaining to eating disorders. And so I really wanted to draw attention to this because it's not that these things are not happening in these communities, it's that I really do think the myths that we talked about at the very beginning of this presentation, like the misconception that eating disorders only affect white upper middle class women or teenagers or particular individuals, really draws attention away from other communities that are actually experiencing very similar experiences.
And I think that this goes back to whether we're even asking the question. Yeah. And I think that looking at financially, for off-island referrals, right? Because that would be the only way that people would access treatment for disordered eating or eating disorders in Samoa. But if physicians, if others are not asking the question, then we won't even capture that data to begin with.
Exactly. And so I really do value opportunities just like this to be able to talk about eating disorders because of that exact point. It's to really get information out, and to be mindful about these things that are indeed occurring across cultures. So really wanted to bring attention to that piece. And also to be mindful about cultural norms around food, eating, and body shape and weight. And so it's very common in Hawaii, and there's historical context to this as well, that those who were overweight, those who were very plump, were actually seen and regarded more highly way back in the day compared to those who were skinny. And that was because there was this emphasis on food and food representing wealth and status. And so, really wanted to be mindful that those kinds of cultural norms need to be considered, and that we as providers and we as the public can't just look at a culture and say, oh my God, they all have eating disorders because they're all about like large bodies and a lot of food, because that's really not the case. It's really then about bringing it back to asking a lot of questions. So, brings me to this question, what does food signify in the Pacific Islands? And so I think about, as Judy was talking about earlier, this role of food in social gatherings, the role of fasting in cultural or religious purposes. I think about in Samoa, Palualo, or in Hawaii, the value of luau's, and that there's a huge, huge emphasis and role of food in connecting with others, and that food shows up a lot in Pacific Island cultures, and it's a way to really embrace each other. It's a way, again, to connect. It's a way to share. It's a way to care about each other. And so, really wanting to think about and drawing attention to the fact that that's not a bad thing. We don't want to say just because our cultures are all about food that we are somehow now disordered in our way of viewing food or eating. We just really want to understand that are people in these situations enjoying food? um, One of the examples that I can think about is, maybe for a lot of us, we go to social gatherings and there's a lot of food and we're just really enjoying the food. We're enjoying each other's company. We're eating, we're engaging, and it's all good. We feel good, except for maybe feeling a little full afterwards. And that can be very different from someone who maybe feels very anxious showing up to social gatherings because they don't want to eat in front of anyone else, or they're afraid of eating the food that is in the spread. um, and they could potentially eat, but may feel like they need to engage in a compensatory behavior like vomiting or over exercising right after. And so we really just want to understand the difference, and that's why we want to ask the question, what does food signify for you? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it a neutral thing? And I'm wondering if anyone else has commentary on what food may signify, or questions around this idea of the role of food within the Pacific Islands.
As someone who loves to eat, um, I guess I'll go first.
Perfect.
I'm not I'm not representing
Malo,
the
Judy.
Samoa. I'm I'm not representing the community. But I just wanted to say, and both my parents are gone, but when Marissa said that, you know, food, there was a time in our lives where food represented wealth and status. That was so the case with my family and my father. My father was like, eat. I don't want to hear anyone be taken to the hospital because they didn't eat. And because our family will be shamed if that's the case. That was his mentality, right? Never mind that we grew bigger from eating, it wasn't the case. But um I I just wanted to say that when we talk about food, for me, I personally feel that what does food signify? For me, in as a people, it signifies respect. It signifies respect because we say in our language, when we have these falavalavas, these funerals, these weddings, these whatever big event that's going on, we offer food. We offer money, we offer food, and we say this is your, and we say this is your fa'aloalo. And fa'aloalo translated into English is respect, because out of respect we are giving you this, and most likely it's food. Today, yes, now everybody gets an envelope. They've replaced it's like what Dr. McCutcheon says in the past. Foundation remains the same, practices differ, practices change. But it's that, it's because the culture, well, that's what I believe, the culture is founded on love and respect. So the food signifies respect, because many of us, when we go to other people's homes, in Samoa, people are so quick to whip up something like, come on,
Yeah.
the mother would say to the kids, come on, hurry up, put on coffee, put on tea,
Hmm.
there always has to be something. And so even with the discussions we have today and doing the work, we always have to bring something to the table. Um,
Yeah.
I remember El Forma ED Fa'alu Yuli. We used to hate the pancakes she would bring, but but we would always say, man, these panqueques, like she would bring these panqueques, $2 bags. We used to hate them. But we forgot it just surpassed us that it wasn't about the food. It was about what
Hmm.
was going on when we were during, partaking in the food. So the food signified a lot. And
Hmm.
I believe it still does today, especially when it comes to discussions. And I was just saying the other day, food can actually change a discussion. It can actually change mindsets, you
Hmm.
know. I mean, well, that's my experience. Thank you for letting me share.
Of
I,
course.
I love what Judy was saying, and I think that that's one thing that I hope doesn't change it. That's an important piece too, is the value of breaking bread with one another. And I think Dr. Sia is talking about the difference between that cultural norm of being able to share with one another and foster a better relationship with one another through those interactions, and it getting to a point where it's even separating or distancing us even more from each other, when we start to have disordered eating or develop eating disorders as a result.
Hmm. Absolutely. So really, again, we're not wanting to discount or devalue the role of food in especially cultures. And so I'm looking at the chat again and I'm smiling because I'm reading a comment that says, I know food is a big part of cultural events. If you run out of food at an event, your name is tarnished for life. And that is very true also in Hawaii. You always bring more than enough. You never bring not enough, and you always offer food. And so, this again is not to say that these things are bad in and of themselves, but really to raise awareness of and bring conversation to how people are interacting with that role. I'm also reading, people are so judgmental about the size of person's bodies, whether they be skinny or obese. If you're skinny, you're sick. If you're overweight, you need to go on a diet. Yes, and so we'll talk about that too in a couple of slides. I'm also seeing food as like a love language in my family, and our cultural offering of food, making food and eating a good meal together resembles love and appreciation and friendships. Absolutely. I think so many positive things like respect and love and care are really embedded in food. And so again, yes, representing hospitality, all of these things, it's so important. And so if we're interacting with food in that way, that's great. That's a great thing. And we don't want to draw any of that value away from these things. Again, it's really about discussing how are people interacting with that role? How are people interacting with food? Is it still that positive thing that conveys a lot of love and respect and care and hospitality? Or is it becoming something else for someone? That's the conversation we want to have. And then also, we really want to think about how food has maybe changed. I'm seeing someone popping up. Did anyone want to add a comment? Perhaps. Okay, maybe not. Pop in if you would like. Um, Changes in food over time. So this is something that I do think is important to know, especially in the Pacific Islands. We don't always have access to the same kinds of food that are available on the US mainland. And so I really wanted to talk about how both in Samoa and in Hawaii, how diets may have changed over time. And so what I was reading, and I hope people can correct me if this is incorrect, but over the past 6 decades maybe, changes in diet. So moving from diets that are maybe more plant-based to relying on more packaged processed foods. And this is something that we do see in Hawaii as well. Shifting from a lot of, I have a picture in Hawaii, we have a lau lau, which is usually pork or chicken wrapped in taro leaf, that's edible and then cooked in the banana leaf in an imu or a umu in Samoa. And then we have poi, which is mashed up taro, very, very nutritious and was very abundant in Hawaii until about times where US occupied, well, even before then, um, when there was Western occupation in Hawaii and a lot of those agricultural lands were um, unfortunately disappeared. And so what we noticed then is that there's this shift from those plant-based abundant foods to a higher reliance on more processed foods. So the rice that we so love in Hawaii, the chicken katsu, which we also love in Hawaii, but is very deep fried, or the mac salad, which is on every single plate lunch here, but is not the best for us, but is oftentimes cheaper to make. And so we we use those things a lot, and really thinking about food accessibility, um really thinking about how there it can be super difficult to access healthy foods, and unfortunately we do see a lot of eating disorders and disordered eating in lower socioeconomic status families, communities, individuals. So really just wanted to highlight that, it's not necessarily a bad thing that we have these plate lunches. I'm looking at how there's a comment, sodas being used instead of new for falavilavis. And so that, again, in and of itself is not a bad thing, but we also want to be really aware of, um, can we diversify? Can we eat different things? Or do I feel like all I'm eating is, for example, I love rice. Is all I'm eating rice? And is that necessarily healthy for me? Not that that means that I have an eating disorder, but really tuning into what is healthy for my body, what is healthy for my family's health and well being. Any comments on food or how food has changed? Okay. So, really wanted to talk about this piece. The next two slides I think are super important, especially for us residing in Pacific Islands. So, really wanted to talk about how health, and I put health in quotation marks for a reason, how health behaviors have changed. So, I really want you all to pause and think about how health behaviors, so this could be diet trends, exercise trends, have changed over time. And so I wanted to highlight in regards to diet these trends of keto, paleo, intermittent fasting, all these different diets that are being touted as very healthy, very beneficial. And indeed, like I really, as I previously stated, like a lot of these things are not inherently bad. These diets can be really great for people, they can have positive impacts on people's health. And also to consider that diets are not one size fits all. And so, really thinking about how we're engaging with diet and if that diet really maps onto something that is healthy for us. Uh, And then, really thinking about in the past maybe 10 plus years, how this fitness inspiration, this Fitspo, has come about. So, health behaviors, as in the top picture, don't stop until you're proud. Some people can look at that and feel like very inspired and very motivated to engage in a healthier lifestyle. And unfortunately, I look at that and I get scared because I really feel like it promotes this unhealthy, potentially, motivation to literally not stop until you feel like you're proud, which could be at varying points in health and wellness. And so really thinking about the idea of bodybuilding, cheat days, bulking, cutting. And again, these things are not necessarily bad in and of themselves. And at the same time, if cheat days are potentially one day where you allow yourself any kind of food that you want, and then you're starting to notice a lot of anxiety that builds before and after, or you're feeling like this cheat day is now becoming unmanageable. I feel like it's out of control. I feel like I can't stop myself from eating now. Or you notice the opposite. I'm cutting food because I want to be more fit and muscular, but now I feel like I can't stop restricting my food intake. That's where we want to just pause. And then lastly, social media use. So there's a lot of research now that's coming about that is demonstrating, particularly in adolescents, but I do think this is going to translate to across ages. Social media use is unfortunately related to negative body image. So, more social media use, higher levels of negative body image in these adolescents. Um, and then there was a study that was conducted in Fiji a while ago that showed TV use. So, that's not exactly social media, but TV use led to higher levels of body dissatisfaction. I'm reading the chat again, so I'm just pausing for comments and questions. I don't think people realize that the words they use to talk to somebody about their body is so hurtful and can damage someone's self esteem and lead to an eating disorder or other mental health challenges. Absolutely. And then I'm reading about diet. Processed and canned food is more available and more affordable. Fresh fruits and veggies are so expensive and not always available in the small village areas. Local stores have junk food and snacks. Yeah. Absolutely. So all of these comments, thank you so much for the comments and thank you so much for being open and vulnerable. The way we talk about these behaviors, people's bodies, the way that we have access to food, all of these things are really important to consider, um, and be aware of and have open discussions about. So, really getting to this idea of body image, I wanted to pose this question: what is the ideal body size and how has it changed over time? And I very intentionally put this picture of the quote unquote typical body for different periods of time. And I know that the, the wording is very small, but basically it fluctuates over time. And you can kind of make note of the different body sizes from slender, high waist, narrow shoulders, symmetrical face. I'm looking about in the middle, Hollywood, curves, slim waist, hourglass figure, large breasts, all the way to the 90s heroin chic wayfish, very thin, androgynous, translucent skin. So I very intentionally put this up because it represents actually one view of an ideal body, and that is the Western ideal, and how this can be really different from many cultures. And so, an example I have is maybe someone, and I did actually have a client that I worked with who struggled with body image and often said, I'm too someone looking. And really asking her, what does that mean? Like, what does that look like for you, and how has that shown up in your life? And really, she disclosed that um, it meant that she felt too heavy or too big in comparison to this Western body ideal of what we have now, which is flat stomach, large curves, um, fit, cut, whatever it is. And she just felt very kind of like, I aspire to this body and I don't have this body because I'm too someone. And then how she interacted with her community and how there was a lot of like, hey, you gained weight, hey, you got fat, and not meant in like a mean way, but as Liza was kind of saying, that it can actually be quite damaging and quite hurtful even if someone's not meaning it in a rude way. And so really thinking about how these body ideals have changed, how Western ideals don't really map on all the time to other cultures body ideals. I can think about, even in, I'll use my own culture for an example, in Asian cultures, growing up and having many family members comment on body size and very outright calling me fat. And me knowing that I'm not fat, I am normal for my height and weight and whatever it was at that point, but them kind of saying it in passing and not meaning it as a bad thing, but it really hurting me as a kid. And so really just wanting to draw attention to that. So any comments on body image? So we want to talk then about how do we look for these things, because we don't want to just, again, think like if someone is gathering around food that it's a bad thing, or that they look a certain way and that's a bad thing. We really want to be thorough with this. And I'm just checking the chat again. I have a younger sister who has made remarks on getting work done on her body when she has the opportunity and money, or going on a massive fasting. And this is someone who's 5'1" and weighs less than 150 pounds. And I ask why. And her reply was showing me a TikTok video of how her body type isn't considered beautiful. And it just shows how social media plays such an influence. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think about, especially with social media and the use of filters. And so there are many filters, a multitude of filters, and just body positioning when folks take a picture, that can really misrepresent a body and a face and just the appearance of someone, and really represents a very Western ideal of quote unquote beauty and an ideal body. And how even if we don't consciously think about, like, oh well, our cultures are different, or I want to be a part of that culture, or whatever it is, we still get affected by these images and the rhetoric that we hear. And so it does definitely play an influence, and I really thank everybody for sharing so openly and honestly. So I do want to talk about this screening approach. And so um we want to talk about things to look for. So I'm going to divvy this up into four things and really think about it as kind of like little flags to be aware of. So it's not just like one of these things means you have an eating disorder. It's really like if you are answering yes to one or more, then kind of inquire further. And so we really want to think about evidence of malnutrition, which often happens in anorexia, or abnormal BMI, which happens across all of the eating disorders. And so this is either a BMI of under 17 or over 40. So those represent like severely underweight, or I think morbidly obese. And so thinking about that, so evidence of abnormal body weight and shape, well, weight, I will say, rather, excuse me. And then thinking about if people are endorsing cardiac or gastrointestinal complaints. So if someone is maybe severely underweight and they're also saying, my heart really, like, it skips a beat, and it's so high, my heart rate is so high all the time, and oh, I also have these stomach issues and it's so sore. We want to just kind of make a mental note. And then also consider as like a next kind of check mark, mental health complaints and concerns. So we want to think about how eating disorders are really comorbid, or they occur with other disorders like depression, anxiety, PTSD, alcohol or substance abuse and use. And so really thinking if someone is then underweight, has cardiac complaints, and also has depression, okay, we're going to make that other mental note in our heads. And then thinking about general risk factors. So, a general risk factor, and this is very general, is being female identified in a gender and being an adolescent or early adulthood. And so, not to say that eating disorders, as we know, they don't only occur in these demographics. We know that they occur across a variety of demographics. But as a general risk factor, these are two of them. And so again, want to make another mental note if this is indeed a risk factor for someone. And then what I really like are the specific risk factors. So this is kind of like if nothing else, I would hope, and I really would like people to remember these two questions, if nothing else. And that is, to what extent does your weight or shape influence how you judge yourself as a person? And have you attempted to severely limit or avoid food, or have you engaged in excessive behaviors that influence your weight and shape? And so I'm toggling back to the chat right now. I think if we are comfortable in our own skin and knowing who we are is a big help, and we need to teach our young girls and boys how important it is to know who they are, or the color of their skin would really help. And Dr. McCutcheon needing to continue to have these conversations, ask questions, and not feel the need to hide the realities of what might be going on in our community. So this is exactly, I totally agree. And I really thank you all for voicing these comments, because exactly, we really just want to bring awareness and we want to have the discussions about these things. And so this screener approach is to really just highlight bringing awareness to. So if nothing else, like focusing on these four things, if not those four things, then the two questions of how to really engage with someone who might be experiencing disordered eating or an eating disorder. Okay. So if perhaps people are really meeting these different, I guess, positive screens. So have some medical evidence, mental health evidence, a risk factor, and then are endorsing, yes, like I do really, I judge myself based on my weight or shape. And I've also engaged in excessive exercise, or I've been purging a lot lately. We want to then move a little bit farther perhaps. And so these are some screens that are, we typically ask providers to use more than just the general public, because the providers will really be able to take these measures and um, assess whether they meet criteria for an actual eating disorder as defined in the DSM. But I do think that it's important to also present these to the community, because they're screens that are readily available on the internet and can be helpful. And so what I don't want to happen is people taking these things and then making or drawing a conclusion on their own. But if people are using these self screeners, that they can take them to qualified providers. So you can take it to a psychologist, psychiatrist, or medical doctor and say, hey, I'm concerned about scores on this. Or if you're if someone else is concerned about their eating habits or their exercise habits or whatever it may be, that you can be a person to say, hey, there's these extra screens out there that might help clarify what's going on. And then, so we have the brief screening approach, we have self report measures. And then to take it a step further, if people are indeed just, yes, this is happening, and yes, I do actually, as evidenced by these screeners, have a high number or a high rate of endorsing a lot of the questions on the EDEQ or the EDDS, then we might want to consider treatment options. And so, whether you're a provider or not, I do think it's important to know what treatments there are out there for eating disorders, especially because doing my internship and residency here at the VA, people often ask me, "What do we do?" And I kind of giggle, because the treatment options are quite translatable to similar treatments for depression, anxiety, and things that we commonly use as providers. But people feel so very afraid to engage with eating disorders that they think there's some other magical, whimsical treatment that is super different, and that's really not the case. And so, one of the, or both of these actually are great treatment options, because what I like about them is that you don't have to have one particular treatment that matches one particular eating disorder. These have both been validated across eating disorders. So whether you have anorexia, bulimia, binge eating disorder, or just subthreshold. So when I say subthreshold, I'm really talking about that other specified category. So not quite meeting criteria for one, not quite, or we're flip-flopping between both disorders or all three disorders, that these two treatments are very effective for both. And so really wanted to just touch on what they are. So CBTE, hold on, I'm gonna just pop back into the chat really quickly. I think that those taking medication is also something that may cause a person to gain or lose weight depending on the medication. That is absolutely true. And so, definitely don't want to step outside of my scope in terms of medication that's used for physical health, managing physical health issues. But we do know in terms of mental health issues, um, some psychiatric medications do cause weight gain or weight loss. And so, something just to notice, and if that's causing distress, like really checking in again on these other things and asking ourselves or asking others questions around how people are perceiving their bodies, how people feel about their bodies, how they're maybe managing their bodies. Okay, so the CBTE really stands for Enhanced Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, and it's based on the idea that a lot of our um the things that happen in the environment, so there could be something that happens in the environment. So perhaps someone says like, "Oh my God, you gained so much weight." And then it leads to someone saying then like, "Oh my God, this person just said I gained a lot of weight. They must think I'm really fat, or they must think I'm just this horrible, ugly person," which can then translate to a lot of behaviors that are very unhealthy. So restricting food intake, binging, and then unfortunately purging can lead to being significantly underweight or overweight. Um, and so, really wanting to think about those things. And if we do think about how something in the environment affects our thought, so maybe a good example is I'm too someone looking is like the case example I go back to, and affecting then the behavior of overeating or undereating or over exercising, and how that becomes then reinforced because then it's I think this about myself. I'm too fat, I'm too skinny, I'm too whatever it is. So I engage in the behavior. And if you're then constantly hearing messaging around, "Oh my God, you gained weight, or you lost too much weight, or you're too skinny, or too fat," how it just reinforces. And so this is a treatment that really pieces those things apart and target each one of them. So any questions on CBTE? Okay. And then I have another treatment that I really like and I've actually used with folks in my own research, and it's called interpersonal therapy. um, Interpersonal psychotherapy, rather. And this is a model that has been adapted from interpersonal psychotherapy for uh, depression. And so, what I do like about this is it focuses less on the symptoms themselves and really thinks about how the symptoms come about because of interpersonal interactions that we have. And so what I really like about this treatment is it mapped on really well to folks that are here in Hawaii, and I think other cultures where there's a heavy emphasis on community or the collective, and really thinking about how we really can't just think about the individual themselves all the time. We have to think about the environment that they exist in, or the families or the communities that they exist in. And so really thinking about how um, different categories of things that come up. So the interpersonal IPT really uh, categorizes four um, negative social interactions. And so this could be grief, so the loss of somebody important in their life, role transitions. This could be moving from child to worker, or parent to grandparent, or something like that. Interpersonal conflict, so this or dispute, so this could be just chronic conflict between spouses. And then interpersonal deficits, which is like lacking ability to communicate effectively or interact in a positive way. And how if those four things are popping up, or even just one of them, how then it can affect how we think about ourselves, how we behave. um, and so IPT is really then focused on how to improve interactions, which then ultimately helps symptoms resolve. So I hope that makes sense. And I'll pause again if there are any questions about treatment options.
And we want to recognize that in Samoa, we know that these services are limited, but it is something to just start to think about those options that are available and that are out there. If there are opportunities to be able to access that or even advocate for it when you go to see a ER doctor or someone else, because we talk about off island referrals for other conditions, but we don't think about off island referrals for this. And these conditions can be life threatening, as Dr. Sia was talking about. And so really starting to think about how do we advocate in that way with our providers.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dr. McCutcheon. I think the reason why I bring these two treatment options to you all is not to say that you have to become a master of doing them yourselves. That's definitely not the case, but it is really to advocate for these treatments. And my hope is that even as I've done this presentation for providers within the VA system, really to advocate, hey, you already have these skills of doing CBT for depression or IPT for depression or anxiety or other disorders. You really actually have the skill sets to do this treatment for folks with eating disorders. And so I bring that to you all to say it's a way to advocate for yourselves and to know that treatment is actually out there, and to encourage people to provide it if it's not available. And so I do have a list of resources. And so there are local resources and general resources that I think are really important and helpful. And then resources for providers that are listed. And so feel free to Google those. I know you don't have the actual presentation that has that hyperlink, but please feel free to Google any of those. And then what I wanted to talk about are just tips for how we interact with somebody who we may be worried about has an eating disorder or who is exhibiting disordered eating. And so some of the warning signs to really recognize this is, are people really restricting food or are they engaging in a diet that is beyond what we normally see? So there's a huge difference about I want to go on a diet because I want to manage my blood sugar level or I want to lose a couple pounds. And once they achieve those things, they kind of just maintain a good, healthy diet versus severely under eating for months on end to the point where someone is exhibiting fear when around food or they're wanting to um, eat by themselves or they're really not wanting to engage in those social events anymore if they're binging and purging. And again, this is not just a one-time thing. This is um, repetitive behaviors that occur multiple times a week over the course of months. And so really thinking about, do we see that in loved ones or friends or in the community? Are we seeing people that are really not happy with their bodies and that they place a huge deal of their self-esteem within that distorted body image? So people saying like, if I can't lose weight or if I can't gain weight, I'm just a failure of a person. That it's really heightened much more than just like, oh, I want to lose a couple pounds because I think I gained a little weight, and that feels a lot different. And then thinking about if people are reporting health complaints. So again, going back to those physical complaints of like, my heart rate's been really, really fast lately, and I've been on this really crazy diet, and I don't feel very good about myself, or I'm having a lot of stomach issues. Thinking about all of these warning signs in conjunction with each other. And then if that is the case, how do we talk to people? So one of the best signs and one of the best tips I could give anyone is picking a good time. So we don't want to just rush somebody and say, I need to talk to you about this very important thing, because that might scare them off or they might have a very negative reaction to that. And so really approaching someone and saying, hey, I really want to talk to you about something. Is there a good time where we could speak privately? And then if that opportunity then arises to have that conversation, really expressing concern, I'm really concerned because you look a bit sad or you look weaker than you normally do. And it's really worrying me. I really want to talk more about this. And then being patient and supportive with that person because unfortunately eating disorders have high relapse rates. And so sometimes it's not just like we address the thing one time and then the eating disorder gets resolved. Sometimes it can be repetitive efforts that are needed. And so there's this huge need for patience and support in this. And then encouraging the person to get help. Again, that support and collaboration is huge. It can just extend many, many miles if we can be supportive and encouraging and collaborative with folks. We can direct them to the resources that have been listed here. We can talk to them about information that we've learned. We can talk about how this shows up culturally and how it aligns with positive health strategies or it doesn't align with that. If it feels like these behaviors are becoming disruptive to our lives, we can talk about those things openly. And I think just talking about all of these things in general helps destigmatize them. And that's really the point of this whole presentation today, is that we want to talk about these things more, especially in the Pacific Islands, because we want to bring attention to them. They are happening despite there not being research right now. And if we talk about it more, I really do think that it just brings light to the fact that these things are going on, and that we can give attention to them.
And I'd like to think about the unfortunate time when there was an increase in the deaths by suicides in Samoa, and how that caught the attention of Department of Health, of the different agencies, to really respond at that time. And the idea is that we don't want to have to get to that point where there's an increase in deaths, and there may be, and we just don't know because we haven't been asking that question. And so that was one of the first steps in terms of suicide prevention, is asking the question. So how
Yeah.
often do we ask that question when it comes to disordered eating? Or do people even think about it, right? Thinking, oh, it's just
Mhm.
that's a palangi thing versus something that's
Mhm.
actually happening in our community. So if
Mhm.
anybody's interested in doing more research around that, I'm all
Yes,
for
that
it.
would be great. Yes, it would be so helpful, because unfortunately, we also have seen an increase in eating disorders and disordered eating after COVID, for a variety of reasons: stress management, anxiety management, proximity to food when we're home, lack of food availability, a lot of things. And I'm just toggling back to the chat. I think that if we treat the person with an eating disorder, we need to treat the family as well, so the person doesn't go back into the environment and may move backwards. Absolutely. That's why I'm a huge proponent of that IPT as a treatment for eating disorders, because it really considers the person within a family system, within an interpersonal system, so that you're addressing, like, really how to communicate about these things even within your family, how you have that conversation meaningfully without everyone flying off the handle, blowing one's top, um, and really addressing what's going on. So thank you so much for that comment. And then that is all I have. And so I wanted to open the space for questions. I know I'm a little bit over, but if there are questions now, feel free to pose them. And if not, please feel free to reach out. My VA email will soon be deactivated, so as I am wrapping up my position here, but you can always email. Dr. McCutcheon, is it okay to forward questions to you? I don't want to put
Yes,
you on
of
the.
course.
Okay, perfect. Okay. I want to thank everybody so much for their time and for your involvement in collaboration. I really appreciate this space to present. It's been such a privilege to be able to collaborate with the Alliance. So thank you so much for everybody's time.
Just waiting on some more questions if anybody else has any questions or comments.
It's almost lunchtime, ironically. Yeah.
You know, Dr. Marissa was sharing earlier how it is, one of the effects or that many of us seem to forget of the impact of the economy because it's so expensive,
Mhm.
but people have always mentioned that, I mean, there's so many people that have also mentioned that when it comes to, it's not cheap to maintain a healthy lifestyle. I mean, when you compare white and brown bread, brown bread is expensive. And for many of us, we can't afford to we can't afford that lifestyle. And so therefore there's a lot of the food that's already been processed, in the store. Uh, and because, which is something I've never understood, why our local food is also expensive when we don't have taxes. I mean, you compare the exported fish to the local fish here or the bottom fish. Yeah, it's expensive to buy bottom fish or, the fish that they sell on the side of the road. Even news, as Dr. McGutcheon was mentioning earlier, you get one small new for $2, and so there's our local stuff is also expensive. And I realize that we have a lot of that nutritional stuff. I mean, a lot of the local stuff is available. Not everybody has papaya, right? But then you can get a papaya on the side of the road for $5. It's but it's expensive maintaining that healthy healthy eating or the healthy lifestyle.
And I'm gonna do a shameless plug too for the hydroponics program through the local ASGVA. Because it's not just for veterans, it's for service members and their families as well. And so it's like designed for suicide prevention, but I think that's also addressing food security. So it's something to really consider. And if you want to learn more, check in with Princess Alva'a or Utsi Gebauer at the local ASGVA.
Thank you, Doc, for that information. That's really important information. So anybody else have anything they want to share?
I just wanted to make a comment on what Judy shared about like how eating healthy has become very expensive. A good example is I would go on YouTube or come across a video or something on how to prepare a healthy meal, right? And I'll write all these ingredients down, and then I'll go to the store, and then I'm over there like, I don't see it here, I don't see it, and then next thing my cart is like, it's just the meat in there, or there's nothing else, and um, I also feel like it's the kind of import that our government, that we bring in. I think we should shift into going into a little bit more on the healthier side rather than just importing like um the variety of meats, junk foods and sweets, and just going into uh a healthier perspective. And if I was to wanting to eat something healthy, um, the first place that I wouldn't go to is a store, to make my own meal. But rather than that, I would have to go like across to Ruby Reds, or somewhere else that, would offer these healthy meals. But I also feel like it's also expensive, compared to preparing your own meal and, trying to live up to the healthy lifestyle that we're trying to get into. But yeah, those are my comments. I just wanted to say that I support what Judy was sharing about, because we do we do struggle when we try to eat something healthy for lunch. We go across and we can't find what we just looked at. Thank you.
I just thought of how the trauma uh, of as young Samoan kids, um, it's when you get a sussa, uh, when your parents scold you, and then like just scolded you really bad, and then afterwards, have you eaten? Go eat. It's like after the disciplining, and then they tell you to go eat. Um, the I don't know, but I just feel like a lot of some of these bad habits of eating and some might start from our upbringing. I the things that you experience as you go through life, and but making that the connection, and I'm so grateful that Dr. Mercer and Dr. Etta are here to make us understand of that connection of the trauma, and that because for many people today, as hard as it is to, and everybody has their different reasons as to why they exercise, as well as those that don't exercise, or, and of course, a lot of people that don't exercise, then people are being judged on how they're lazy, and of course, like I said, people have different reasons, but that trauma can become suicidal for many, especially if you live in a community uh, that shames people of what they look like, and all. I'm hoping that we're not that kind of community. I don't want to say we are or we're not, because I don't know what goes on in every home. But I do believe that a lot of the homes also, that's where a lot of that body shaming is coming from, especially like from some of the mothers that, when they see their children, or the girls or the boys, I mean, look at you, do something with yourself, that kind of stuff, you're and because also we also come from a big comparison uh uh community or people. We like to, it's almost like every time we're trying to discipline or our children, or someone, we're always comparing them to someone else. Look at how great she looks, look at how wonderful she's doing, and um so that trauma, and I'm not saying, oh my God, thank God, thank God now I know what trauma is. And that's why I'm overweight, because of the trauma. It's not an excuse, but um just understanding that portion, that, and because some of us, when we go through things, food is like the first responder or comfort, right? Especially um when there are so many things that we go through. And like Mona was saying, there was a comment that Mona had mentioned. You might have an extravagant event, but if there wasn't enough food, yeah, you will be marked and scarred for life for that event, right? You will remember. It's so real. You hear people talk about, you will remember the wedding that didn't serve enough food, that you might have drunk all the beer, all the liquor at that wedding, but if they didn't serve enough food, they will say it was okay, man med, liangan fall of lavi, me I, that's it's um but I don't like to think of that. I don't like to think of that. I love to think of food. And that's a nature of human nature, right? That you hear a lot in our people. And well, we Samoans, we like to say, if we Samoan, say us Samoans, we always say that, But I like to think of it as I like to think of food as, like Mariah was saying, fellowship, hospitality. I like to think of food as that. Um, even comfort, when people are sick, we go and we take food. We go, even if you just don't know whether you might kill the patient with that food you're taking. I mean, the doctor's probably telling the patient, you need to quit your sodium. And here you are with your soup, that you just put 3 spoons of salt in it. And you're like, we come with food. It's and I just when I say I love food, it's not that I love to eat it. Of course, yes, of course I love to eat food, but I just love what food represents. I just can't imagine the kind of world we would live in if there was not food. But then understanding that the trauma that it also brings. But we don't blame food, right? Right, Dr. Marissa? Food is not the cause. It's the things that go on in our minds, and right, what our bodies are going through, our emotions, our
Absolutely.
feelings, right?
Mhm.
And it's almost like food is like what some people compare, like people in AA. right? Alcoholics, like the things they go through, and then they just reach. It's like booze is. What was it? What did you say it was? Addictive.
Mm-hmm.
Addictive.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Thank
Yep.
you, Jesus. Food is not bad. It's not bad.
Food is
Food is
not
good.
bad. Food is
No.
not bad. It's just how we interact with it. Yeah. Yeah.
All
Just
right.
like our relationships with others, it's what our relationship is with food.
Mhm.
That's the key. Yes.
Yes.
And then, you know, especially in our culture, sometimes "Tia kere ka ako amu." And so I know growing up, my uncles always called my mom slim, slim in a amu way, like a making fun way, right? And so like those kinds of things, you know, it's like we just see it as, oh, okay, you know, that's funny, haha, you know. But over time, we don't know how that could impact certain people. Like I think Liz brought up, and maybe even Mona too, how some of our aamu ways could actually be impacting some of the people in our lives.
Yes, for sure. I think that's such a great point, Dr. McCutcheon. And I hope, like, if nothing else, I always think it's a good test for people to gauge how they, like, not even say, but what they think when they see people of different shapes and sizes. Because it's very interesting to think about, just for myself, how judgmental I can be, and then remind myself, like, I don't know what that person is actually going through. And I remind myself about the stat, like, eating disorders affect people of all shapes and sizes, and that majority of folks will be of average weight or overweight. And so really thinking about, the healthiest people can look completely different from what I think that they look like.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm always traumatized when I go to New Zealand, and one of my uncles there, and today when I go to New Zealand, I wouldn't care less if I see him or not, because every time he sees me, he's like, "Oh my gosh, you're fat, you're fat." That's like his greeting, like what Dr. Ito was saying, like, um, and I don't know if he meant harm, but I did feel hurt. I always do feel hurt when he says that. And so every time, so my thing is when he says that, in order for me, because rather than just disappearing, or rather than just saying something bad back at him, so every time when he says, "Oh my gosh," every time I see you, you're the same, you're fat, you're fat. And then I always try and finish his sentence by saying, "And beautiful," right, uncle? And beautiful, and beautiful. And then I don't know. I don't know if it does him any good, because he keeps saying, "You're fat and beautiful. You're fat." And it's almost like we have this song going on. So now today, every time I go to New Zealand, "Did you want to go see Uncle Andrew?" "No, I'm good. I'm good." Yeah, I'm sure Uncle Andrew's good too. But it's traumatizing. But see now, like for me, every time I go to New Zealand, now that red flag goes up, right? That antenna goes up, like, don't see Uncle Andrew. It's but it shouldn't be like that. So yeah. Um, I think we don't have any more comments. We have Mona here saying, "I would like to see American Samoa use the ACE test." We should, yes, exactly, Mona. We need to do it. Yes. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Liz and Mona, for sharing your stories. It is always an honor to hear your stories. Without time, I think we're good to wrap it up. Right, Doctor? Was there anything else you two wanted to add?
Nothing on my end. I really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you all for everything.
No, just grateful. You know, Judy says she only has a couple of hats, but I know that that's not the truth. She has very many hats, especially in the Alliance. So I'm grateful for our Alliance partners always. You know, that we offer these, but if you all weren't there, then we would just be talking to ourselves. So thank you all for continuing to be present and hopefully move it forward and advocate in our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Doc. Thank you so much. Before we end, on behalf of the Executive Director, Jennifer Fayono, and the Board of Directors and Partners of the Alliance, we want to thank Dr. Marissa Sia for another wonderful discussion today. We hope this is not the last one. This is so, this discussion was very informative today, and I strongly believe it's because this is at our doorstep. This is happening to us. We can relate, right? We have so much to say. We have so much to say about it. So thank you so much, Dr. Sia, for bringing this to the forefront. Thank you for always saying yes to the Alliance. We appreciate you. We appreciate the work and the information that you get to share with us. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Dr. Joetta McGutcheon, who is out there. Safe travels back home, Doctor. Thank you for everything you do as well for our community, and making sure that we have those resources. We have those resources available, the information, anything that our people are also privy to getting that information. People like Dr. McGutcheon, she makes those connections out there so that people like Dr. Sia is able to join us, become a partner, become an ally, become someone vital to the work moving forward, because this is what we need for our people, especially with everything that's going on. And we hope that everybody that's listening or watching this is able to see why we're talking about this, because I'm sure someone is thinking, well, this is the Alliance. Why are we talking about eating disorders? If you're able to connect the trauma that we were talking about, then you understand how where the causes of violence can also come in. Because when we're not well, and this has, if not anything or everything to do with, a lot to do with mental health. You know, our minds need to be well. Food is a big part of that. How we use our food can make us well or not. And then, of course, the results can be violence, can be traumatizing, and then we end up hurting others along the way when we are not well. But we need to understand all of this, and we hope that in understanding this, we come to the realization that, you know, we have the opportunity and to change, and we can change things, you know, but we have to understand we can't change if we don't know what we don't know, and if we're not aware of things. So thank you very much, Dr. Sia and Dr. Joetta McGutcheon, for joining us today. That's a wrap, everyone. Thank you for joining us on another webinar here at the American Samoa Alliance, brought to you by the American Samoa Alliance Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. We hope that some of the information discussed today was helpful. And for more information about today's webinar, today's information, eating disorder, please connect with us. Our number is 684-699-0272, or you can find more on the work of the Alliance on our Facebook page at the American Samoa Alliance Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, or visit our website at www.asalliance.com. Have a good rest of the day. Soifua.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Marissa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Dr. Etsa.
Bye.